Make a motion to approve the minutes from January 27th.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Then the motion to accept the minutes is submitted, passes, and we can now open up the public comment, but there is no one here for public comment, correct? Okay, very good. We're glad to have you though, Patty. And we will move on to the planning staff presentation regarding flood regulations.
Good morning, planning board members, public. I think we're at a point in time where it might be helpful to walk you through where we are in our recovery and also to talk about floodplain management in general. So myself, I'm one of the 4 certified floodplain managers for the county. I've had my certified floodplain management certification since 2007. I used to be on the board of the Association of Floodplain Managers for the state. We have one floodplain administrator for the county, and we also provide services to some of the other municipalities, which means we administer the flood ordinance for them as well. Woodfin is a good example of this. Weaverville, Asheville does their own. Black Mountain does their own. And Montreat works with Land of Sky, and then Biltmore Forest only has a teeny bit of floodplain in their jurisdiction. That being said, I put together some slides that if we can get beyond whatever weird green screen this is, I'd like to show you all to walk you through the basics and kind of tell you where we are in the process and what we have to do as members of the National Flood Insurance Program. Okay, yeah. All right, she's hooking me up here. So while we're working through the kink on this, the county has been a member of the National Flood Insurance Program since 1980. So that's a very long time. And one of the most important things about the state of North Carolina is unique. We are one of, I believe, 3 states. We have North Carolina, Texas, and Oklahoma. And we are what's called a cooperating technical partner with FEMA. What that means is since the year 2000, the state's in the driver's seat of redoing the maps, every map cycle. The reason this is such a great relationship to have is because when I have a question about the National Flood Insurance Program, rather than pouring through hundreds and thousands of pages of FEMA guidebooks and documents, I can go straight to the state and ask them questions. Our National Flood Insurance Program coordinator, his name is Steve Garrett. He's based out of Raleigh. We also have a Western Carolina representative, and that Western representative is my go-to. Before Helene happened, we actually went through an audit. Audits are required periodically, and we passed with flying colors. The audit name for the National Flood Insurance Program is called the Community Assistance Visit. And we're going to talk about more in just a bit. One of the most common questions that gets asked to me is, are we getting new maps? The answer to that is we are 3 to 4 years out from our next mapping cycle, and that's important. The last thing you want after you've had a tragedy and a disaster of this scale and scope is to have to redo all of your maps. We'll talk a little bit more about why it's important that we have time to wait before we get new maps, because there's going to be a lot of self-healing of our streams, our rivers. I know a lot of them have jumped their course, but we'll dive into that in just a second with a couple of graphics that I have. So the current maps that we have are what's called the 2010 maps. And starting this month, the state is actually flying planes using LiDAR data. This is laser data. It gets bounced off the earth. It measures all the physiographic features. It looks at all the different contours and topography. And that's the first step in getting new maps. There's still going to be hydrography and hydrology analysis that goes along with that. It does take a lot of time to get it right. We have 2 areas that we study here predominantly. I'll show you in these graphics coming up. One's called limited detail study areas. These are areas that are going to be found more in the rural areas. They do not have a defined floodway. And what you guys are most commonly used to seeing Take the French Broad River, for example. You have a defined floodway. You'll have what's called a fringe or 100-year, and you have what's called the 500-year as well. We'll talk about that more in a second. The key takeaway that I want everybody to remember when you leave here today: no two properties are created equal. No two flood zones are created equally as well. This graphic here represents what people are most used to seeing when it comes to a floodplain. In the pink there, this by the way, this is right in the heart of Swannanoa. So this is a good example for today to talk specifically about Helene. The pink area is the floodway. The floodway always carries the water course itself, and it almost always floods during an event. Whether that be it comes up over the banks, whether it be it's a very flashy sort of shallow area like the Hominy Creek or Flat Creek in Black Mountain, it's the area where it always spills out and conveys water. The 100-year is a bit of a misnomer, and as we move along with climate change, we may need to adjust some of our wording, and I'll talk why in just a second. But this is a 1% annual chance. And a lot of people think, flooded last year, I'm not going to flood for another 100 years. Absolutely dead wrong. 1% chance any given year. Yes, this area flooded excessively during Helene. The green area, look at the very bottom there. There's a couple pockets, one to the north, one to the south. That's what's called the 500-year. That drops down to a 0.2% annual chance. These areas heavily flooded during Helene. The 500-year, we do not currently have any regulations. A lot of communities don't have regulations. But that opens up an opportunity for us to have a discussion here in a little bit about what could change in the future. We saw excessive amounts of flooding, specifically in Swannanoa, that far exceeded the 500, which makes it probably appropriate to deem this more of a 750 to 1,000 year event. Now, there are a lot of dynamics in Swannanoa that we can talk about in particular. One is debris dams. The other are lower bridges that do not convey water like, say, modern bridges do. There are a lot of bends in the river. When you have a flood event, a flood does not obey its bends. It does not obey its channel. It goes straight. Ken, you sent me an article earlier. I want to talk a little bit about floating homes and what other countries are doing as well. Please remind me, and we'll bring that up to kind of towards the end. Is everybody following along so far?
Yes, sir.
I want to leave plenty of room for questions. All right. 2 scenarios I like to put up before you. We all know that we have older housing stock. No one's going to question that. We have a lot of homes that were built 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, lots of homes that were built in the 70s. What do all these homes have in common? None of them are built to modern flood standards. So, for instance, all of Beacon Village, we do know that, that was a lot of the historic factory town. A lot of Beacon Village was in the 500-year floodplain. 500-year. Yes, that's amazing to think that it went all the way across the street and went to that side. You okay, Ken? Okay. So scenario 1 is your typical what's called pre-firm structure. Flood insurance rate map is what firm means. So think of anything that was built before you joined the program. We joined the program in 1980. So a lot of these homes, they're slab on grade. A lot of your older homes, like that were, say, built in the 1920s and 10s and previous to that, some of those just had like large rocks that they were supported on. The reason this is so important is that it hit many areas that had this older housing stock. Some people even thought they'll get Samaritan's Purse or another group in and muck it out and they could save the house, only to find that they either floated off their foundation, they had no foundation. So even though after a flood event something may look perfectly fine, it does not tell the full story. And we're going to talk about why it's important and where we are in that stage here in just a second. Scenario 2 is a home that's built to modern standards. So what that means is you have what's called base flood elevation. People use that term a lot. That just means different elevation points that are on your property that are built to a standard to meet the current floodplain ordinance. However, I will report to you all that we've always had a higher standard called a freeboard. A freeboard means you have 2 feet above the base flood elevation. That's what you have to build to pursuant to our ordinance. That gets you to what's called the regulatory flood elevation. So in this scenario, you see a home that's elevated. It's elevated on block. You also see what's called flood openings in there. So those are also called flood vents. One example, as you can see, there's a line of homes that I'm sort of hovering over here. Those are a set of duplexes that were built to standards. They still took about 3 to 4 feet of water, but they do not float off their foundation because the flood vents work.
The ones that are brand new, they look brand new by the cement factory.
Yes, and they're just in a row.
Yeah. It's amazing what they're still standing on.
Still took 3 to 4 feet of water, but the flood vents equalize the pressure because you got these pressures in a riverine setting when that water's coming in one force, one speed, swirling around, scouring, doing all the things you don't want to ever see, but the home stayed intact. Those homes can be rebuilt as is. In this setting as well, you'll also see that the HVAC unit is elevated on a platform. This is good, resilient construction. But we are probably going to see the state in their next flood model ordinance cycle when we get our new maps propose an even higher freeboard. We'll talk about that in a second. Commercial buildings are different from residential. I want y'all to think about some of the breweries around town. They're old industrial buildings. They're concrete floor. They have metal walls. These can be built back to a different standard. You can use what's called wet flood proofing, or you can use like cementitious board, things that can get wet and dry out. Or you can do what's called dry flood proofing, where you can build like a flood wall around the structures. That's a good thing because those structures are just built very differently. Think of O'Reilly Auto Parts, the one in Black Mountain took 3 or 4 feet of water, as did the ABC store. Places like that can muck it out. Most of the losses in those commercial buildings are going to be contents. Now, a lot of them gets a lot trickier when you start talking about upfitting those industrial buildings, those older buildings for restaurants, retail, where you're bringing in lots of expensive furnishings and things like that. But again, for instance, the tobacco barn, that was all contents. It's a metal building on concrete. I've got a 1977 picture of a flood event, similar conditions, flooded. So it's a repetitive flooding scenario for places like that. Where we are in the process is after the event took place. Let me make sure. This again is Swannanoa. We are between the Whitson Avenue Bridge and the Riverwood Bridge. The Riverwood is right at that bend there. That's where the wording 100-year or fringe is. And then go to the east on the purple, right to the extent of where you see those dots. That's going to be the Whitson Avenue Bridge. And a lot of people say, well, why was the flooding so bad in particular in this area? Okay, so you had 2 bridges, 2 debris dams formed, and you also had a bend in the river right there at Asheville Christian School. All those points are damaged points, damaged structures. The ones that are not within the purple, the ones that are not within the blue, are not within the special flood hazard area. To push water that far back and put that amount of water in Ingalls is a phenomenal flood. But it also explains the different dynamics of what you're seeing. So when you have that much debris that stacks up against those bridges, it has to go somewhere, and that's where you get your backwater effect. The growing, the pooling, and until you have a relief valve for that water to go on, you're going to have flooding of that scale when you have an event like this. After a flood event, one of the most important things we had to do is get out of the Emergency Operations Center, which this event was so terrible and had so many dynamics to it. We all know we had terrible communications. We all know we didn't have potable water. We didn't have electricity. We had blocked roads. We had roads that didn't exist. If we'd had a more common flood, like we'd seen like in '04, we would have been out in the field immediately doing assessments. Now, assessments come in different forms. The first assessment you do is usually swift water and life safety, so you know what you're looking for there. You're finding your loss of life. You're finding people that are wounded. You're finding people that are hurt. You'll see still to this day X's on the side of a building, and there's a methodology that the firefighters and the different first responders use. The next set of assessments come with the permits and inspections people, the people that work in this building, and they go out and they look for issues related to structural damage, the potential for a structure to collapse, hurt someone even further, and it's a basic assessment. So think of having to go out and look at thousands and thousands of structures. The next assessment that takes place is absolutely required to maintain our membership in the special flood hazard area. And let me tell you why it's so important that we have to inspect all of these. When you're a pre-firm structure, either built before we joined the National Flood Insurance Program or in a previous mapping cycle, because remember, different mapping cycles, the floodplain that can change. You are held to no more of an improvement than 50% of the market value of your structure. If you exceed that amount, you have to bring your structure into compliance. Now, let me tell you what a typical day looks like in a day of a floodplain manager in the planning department. Phone rings, someone walks in the lobby. Hey, I just got this letter from you guys that says I may be substantially damaged. What do I do? Okay. We start with how much water you've taken into your house, what the cost estimate could potentially be, and then we work from there. Now, a lot of people are choosing to make their repairs as is, and they're under that threshold. But let me tell you what it doesn't do. It does not diminish your risk of a future flood event. What we'd like to do with folks, and we'll talk about this program that's coming to town in detail in just a second. It's called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. I'm also handing out a flyer that says, here's a program that can elevate your house to the regulatory flood elevation free of charge to you, thanks to the state of North Carolina and the U.S. federal government. So we do have that option, and we'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. But we are almost finished with sending out all the letters, and we are very much in the world of permitting and getting hammers swinging and bringing people back online. Now, I'm going to pause there because this next section, do you just want to wait for questions at the end, or you want me to just finish these last two and then we can go from there? It's up to y'all.
Go ahead and finish.
Okay.
And then, because you may answer a question I have.
Okay, sounds good, Carl. Okay, so let's talk about higher standards. Let's talk about what we can do and what we can't do. And then let's talk about a program called the Community Rating System. So every time you get a new set of maps, there will be a new model ordinance that the state puts out. Now, a lot of it's going to be really boring regulatory stuff that I'm not going to put you to sleep with today. But a lot of it are changes based on changing conditions. And one of those things that I mentioned earlier is a higher freeboard. So 2 feet is the recommended, and we have that. So congratulations, Buncombe County, for having a higher standard for many years. The next model ordinance is probably going to recommend a 4-foot freeboard. Now, flooding is a little different here in the mountains than it is in the coast, and it's actually scarier. So as someone that's actually been through his 10th career storm, I can tell you this one scared me to absolute death, because riverine flooding events are extraordinarily scary in the mountains. Seeing that amount of flooding at the far stretches of the Swannanoa River, seeing that amount of flooding all the way back to the small streams that are not even located in a special flood hazard area is phenomenal. Seeing that many landslides, blowdowns of trees, the conditions were almost a perfect storm. But it's also what can happen in an atmosphere that's carrying a lot more moisture. It's also what can happen when you had almost a pretty significant flood event before we even had Helene hit. And it's what can happen when you had a full-blown actual tropical storm over the mountains. I don't recall us ever having a full-blown tropical storm over the mountains. We may have one that was barely under, but that's pretty incredible. We can adopt higher standards. We can do them a couple of different ways. We could look at doing a couple of things now with a lot of sensitivity about changing the rules midstream for folks that are in very tough situations. The best way to adopt higher standards that can result in something very positive for the community is called joining the community rating system. The community rating system is a program available to members of the National Flood Insurance Program, like we are, that allows you to adopt higher standards, including higher freeboards, doing other things, even education, building more resilient, adopting a standard in the 500 year. Why this is so important is if we join the community rating system, it translates into a discount for flood insurance holders across the county. So we made it a goal of the comprehensive plan. Now they're tiered. Depending on the higher level you get, the more discount you get. There are some communities in North Carolina that enjoy a 30 to 40% discount. So that is something to consider. It's also consistent with our hazard mitigation plan and our comprehensive plan. Now, before we delve into questions you all might have, this is another thing I like to remind folks. When people move here, they always want a view, a stream. I hear stream a lot. Babbling brook. But the thing I like to tell people is that babbling brook can be your worst enemy during a flood event. We all know that, having lived here as long as we have. So should I get flood insurance? Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're in a special flood hazard area, most of the time you're required to carry a mortgage. Anytime you're adjacent to a water course. Anytime you're outside of a special flood hazard area, but you have a lot of impervious area. Think of the amount of impervious area that's at the Ingalls Swannanoa, all that surrounding area, the bridges, the infrastructure, the amount of paved material. One thing to think about is if you're not in a special flood hazard area, you have a home that's cut into a slope, you have a basement. Water table can push water through your basement through what's called hydrostatic pressure. If you do not carry flood insurance, you will be denied. Happened to me. Last house in Black Mountain. Flooded repetitively. Come to find out the previous contractor didn't pull permits, filled in a sump pump with concrete. And the reason I found out is because I saw sump scratched out on the electric panel. I had to pay $40,000 to have the entire basement retrofitted. When in doubt, yes. If you're a National Flood Insurance Program holder, they have what's called ICC, Increased Cost of Compliance. That's $30,000 to go towards raising your house. So flood insurance is a very, very, very good thing. Lastly, I put in here just so you all could also see some of the different dynamics that have occurred. We've talked a lot about alteration of water courses, scouring, loss of property. Probably what's going to happen, and I'd be more than happy to bring in our folks from Soil and Water, but they are engaged in a program called Emergency Watershed Protection, EWP. This is a program through the U.S. government with help from the state. And what it does is it looks at rebuilding and restoring stream banks. Probably we're going to have to see a lot of restoration, and you've already partly seen it along the Swannanoa and Fritz Broad for sure. Have you all, a show of hands, who's been up to Beatree after the event? Just Beatree Road. Drive Beatree, and you'll see a situation, think of any road across the county where the water course weaves in and out under the road. Tremendous damage, complete blowdowns when the winds encountered the ridges that came over, knocked down a lot of the trees. Water course jumped all over the place, destroyed many private roads, bridges, breached ponds. But areas like that are definitely going to need to see some level of restoration. And that's going to take work with Army Corps of Engineers. By the way, you all have seen debris starting to get removed. Army Corps is our contractor. Army Corps has begun the debris removal on our streams and water courses as well. You're going to see some pretty fancy equipment, even using organic hydraulic fluids. So they are sensitive. They'll let air out of the tires so the pressure decreases. Scenario, if you're at the beach, you're driving on the sand, you have to let air out of your tires. So that's done to lessen any damage. But the amount of vehicles and debris, it's going to take years. And I think we all need to at some point volunteer for some trash cleanup, because it's going to take the whole community for us to recover. With that being said, that's my way of trying to cram where we are with things in this short amount of time. What questions do you all have? What can I answer for you all?
I want to just get a sense of what the county and the region are doing in terms of bringing, if anything, bringing in outside advice. And I have a couple of specific things in mind, because in Woodfin, we're thinking about this, even though Woodfin did not get hit as bad as some communities. We're in the process of looking at the CRS as well. I know that in 2019, there was something in Charleston, South Carolina, called the Dutch Dialogues. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Mm-hmm. The Dutch have monetized their expertise, and they came and took 4 specific zones around Charleston and said, we are Dutch. We know what it is like to live in a flooding sea-coastal area. And they recommended 4 specific things for each area. They're very tailored. The Germans also have seen a lot of river flooding recently. And I'm just curious if the county is bringing in outside things as you consider the long-term plan. And concurrent with that question is, given the state's new mapping cycle, and the fact that we live in a kind of a mother may I state, what flexibility will the county and the municipalities have to exceed the recommendations from the state?
Okay. Sure. Those are great questions. First of all, we administer Woodfin's flood for Woodfin. I understand Woodfin may be looking to join or take over responsibility maybe later this year, I'm just hearing some rumblings about that. So there's 3 properties I've been working extensively with, specifically in Woodfin, that being Zillico Brewing. We got a good outcome on that. Silverline was very exceptionally tricky because very complex campus, lots of buildings that don't meet any kind of standards. But we have brought in, and I have embedded with me now, the former state NFIP coordinator that works for a company called Tetra Tech, which is a recovery contractor. Because this event was so large in scale, we had to bring in people to augment our humble staff. So we've got John Gerber with us and Dave Sterrett. And Dave Sterrett used to be the Eastern rep for the state. So both of these gentlemen, and John Gerber's actually from this area. So for instance, I've actually sent John recently to meet with both Silverline and Republic Waste people about reconstruction, and that should have Woodfin pretty much tied up. Now, to your question about other higher standards and bringing in people in foreign countries that have experience, title is very different. So Ken, what you sent me earlier with your floating home analogy, the floating homes, floating docks work very good as tides go in and go out. Mm-hmm. Riverine, unfortunately, adds more complexity to utilizing those type of features here, only because when we do get our flood events, the force of the water rather than coming up is the dynamics are completely different. Sure. However, they're not without merit. One thing that we could look at, and after 2004, there was a robust plan that fell apart, unfortunately, to use Warren Wilson's lands for what's called compensatory storage.
Mhm.
So the Army Corps of Engineers was brought in, and this was very much a city project to help alleviate flooding in Biltmore Village. So the idea is with compensatory storage, if you come up with a series of levees during a flood event that can be controlled, and you auto flood, say Warren Wilson's Fields, that's called compensatory storage. So you're doing an action to keep from a reaction occurring further downstream. Now, unfortunately, again, that project fell apart, but I would anticipate that there will be more studies for situations that we can look at there. Now, think about all of your Army Corps communities, all those communities like, say, Nashville, Chattanooga, places that TVA, a lot of those are going to be flood controlled cities that actually have large functioning dams on different water courses. I don't know that we're ever going to see anything like that occur here just because we're just so much different. And we don't, a lot of those rivers, say like even in Tennessee, are barge rivers. So like the Ohio, the Kentucky, or Mississippi, I don't anticipate we're going to see anything, but we could do a lot of different micro projects. And a lot of it too is, especially with the hazard mitigation grant program here, how much do we want to do a further session on hazard mitigation and CRS? I'm happy to do it. But right now what we're seeing is elevation projects, buyouts. So we did some buyouts in 04. You can see them on the Shenandoah River when we had a similar setup. Think about growing that program times 100. So tomorrow night, I'll be going to the commissioners to give them an update on all of our different applications. A couple of other buckets that the hazard mitigation grant program is going to be looking at are landslide remediation as well. But the big ones for flood are always going to be elevation, demolish and rebuild, or buyout. And when you buy out a property owner, it comes offline. So it gets
Right.
deed restricted, it remains as green space, but you know what that does? That's fine. Let it flood naturally, it goes away. That's one less property that you have to worry about significant property damage in the future.
Is there any opportunity in the current environment to do, I would call it strategic buyouts, where you're trying to get contiguous properties so that you have larger flood compensation?
Yes, we're actually seeing that happen organically.
Okay.
So a lot of what we're seeing is purchases of property that are adjacent to previously purchased properties,
Right.
like in 04,
Yeah.
because it's almost the same story that happened in 04. 04 was back-to-back tropical events. This time we had a non-tropical antecedent event
Yeah.
that occurred before the tropical event, but it didn't matter because the rivers were already spilling over their banks at that point.
Yeah.
So
No,
it's a
it's like-
similar setup.
Yeah. I think, was it maybe Houston? They had an opportunity to do that after flooding.
Good. I'm glad you brought that up. So Houston had Harvey, Wilmington had Florence. So it sat there on both events and it rained out 30 inches or more of rain. Our situation was we had one event, so my house in Ridgecrest, I'm right on the escarpment. That's the worst place you want to receive that amount of rain because it goes down both sides. So that's why Old Fort got hit so bad. But I call it the D for damage. Line straight north and south through the city of Asheville, follows the French Broad, draw your D out east, hit Barnersville, hit Black Mountain, hit Fairview, hit Guerin Creek, everything in that D damages. Fred in 2021, we all know hit Haywood disproportionately. We had all that flooding in Crusoe.
Can.
Yes, Canton. And Canton got hit again very badly, unfortunately. But no two storms are created equal. So no two flood events are created equal. So yeah, there's opportunities.
Okay. And in terms of what we can do above and beyond this, the state remapping or new
we can make some adjustments in the flood ordinance. One thing that I've mentioned to a couple of commissioners is right now, from a capacity perspective, don't think of me anymore as director. Think of me as your floodplain manager that's with the other four.
Mhm.
So, well, there's four of us total for the entire county. So I'm back in the saddle. Bread and butter, what I grew up with. And that's fine. Keeps me sharp, keeps us on our toes. What I anticipate is probably let's get through a period of seeing where people are with insurance payouts, where people are with applying for a hazard mitigation grant program, further along with renovations and new builds. We'll see what that looks like. Let's study it for a little while, and then let's see what makes sense to phase in, maybe 6 months out or something.
Shouldn't we be encouraging people to leave the floodplain?
Yes. So
Now, because with global warming, there are going to be more significant weather events and at more frequency. So shouldn't we be encouraging people to take the FEMA buyout and leave?
I wouldn't say like leave just because.
Well, relocate.
Right.
That's what I meant.
Yes.
Leave the floodplain.
Yes, if you walk into the planning department, you're going to see a whole Helene recovery table, and front and center is going to be the hazard mitigation grant program flyers. To your point, before you got here, Tim, I was explaining hazard mitigation grant
I
program.
apologize for being late.
It's okay, but they do three like major traditional things after a flood event: buyouts, elevation projects, and demolish and rebuild to new standards. One of the things we also talked about is while we have a higher standard for elevating, it's called a freeboard. We are probably gonna see an increased freeboard, meaning 3 to 4 feet in the future.
Like corner kitchen.
Yeah, so let's talk about Biltmore Village a little bit because I know a couple of y'all have mentioned a couple of things. Go ahead.
And I have a question about Biltmore Village, and I know it's probably in the city of Asheville
Yes.
jurisdiction, but as a person who's lived here my entire life, one of the things that I've witnessed, I guess personally, is that over the decades, people along the Swananoa right there in Biltmore would pour concrete and keep extending and pushing into the riverbanks. And from my childhood, what I remember then and what's now is we have a Swananoa River in Biltmore that's very channeled. And so if you get any amount of excess water, it's just up and out.
Right.
And the flooding seems worse now than it did in the 1970s when I was a child. Are there any plans to look at the Swananoa through Biltmore, through that part of Buncombe County, and try to restore the stream bank so that there's some flood capacity there instead of having such a channeled Swananoa River in Biltmore?
I'm going to break that into 2 responses. Biltmore Village, as we all know, it's in the city of Asheville. City of Asheville maintains their own flood membership in the NFIP. Asheville is a member of the community rating system. Now they're the lower tier, so I think they get about a 10%, 5 or 10% discount. Biltmore Village repetitively floods. We all know that because we've all seen it repetitively flood over and over and over. However, Biltmore Village is a bit different. It is a historic district. Now, Biltmore Village is at a crossroads now. It's been rebuilt over and over and over. It flooded terribly in 2004. Having worked at the city, I can tell you I worked on the retail building that's elevated and has parking underneath. I worked on the Bohemian Hotel. The Bohemian Hotel was dry flood proofed. However, the floodwaters went right over top because it was such an extreme event. And even 30 Brook Street, which is the retail building, took a lot of water in it as well. Biltmore Village is precariously located at the confluence of Sweeton, Swananoa, and the French Broad. And again, remember earlier we talked about backwater effect? If I showed you the flood map, you would see that effect taking place and affecting all of Biltmore Village. Now, Biltmore Village is further encumbered by the fact that years ago, they did a very good aesthetic product to bury all the power lines. Unfortunately, all of the power lines, all the transformers, all of that infrastructure was extraordinarily compromised, and that's why they are still working to restore power there. The crossroads Biltmore Village is at now is, do we elevate and do we do things that build more resilient? Ken, you mentioned Charleston. Great point. Charleston's seeing repetitive situations of sunny day flooding, king tides. So they are actually at a crossroads now, and you can do it very tastefully. It's a lot more expensive. One time, the only time you should ever grant a flood variance is for historic structures in historic districts. Again, commercial buildings enjoy a couple of additional things that you can't do in residential. Part two, you had mentioned man-made interface that's actually causing flooding to potentially be worse. Yes. And that is why membership in the flood insurance program is so important. And that's why adopting standards is very important. Now, there's not a lot you can do when you're at a confluence of that many water courses interfacing with each other. But certainly every time you add impervious area, some of those building practices you mentioned are not allowed anymore, but they were done and they're studied in the model. And the channel you described, let's take you to another area of town where I want to point out a deep channel. So you're at East Asheville exit, you're gotten off 40, you're right there, and you want to go left to where used to be the root bar on your way to the VA. So you're turning left on 70. The amount of power that came through the Swannanoa when it hit all those bends and it encountered the bridge there at 70, it completely scoured and separated 70 from the bridge itself. It put the pool table and the root bar through the window. And to your point earlier, when you have a deep channel, so if this is your floodplain fanning out for an area where you only had just, say, a very shallow pan for your water course. But when you have a deep channel, your floodplain shrinks. But in a flood event of this significance, to your point, it's going to come out and it's going to flood. Go ahead, Tim.
By contrast, Karen Craig Nolan Park fares well. Almost no damage. Riparian zones, native plants, almost no damage.
Yes.
That's a lesson.
Yes, it is. And it's very tricky whenever you introduce an urban interface that has been so water dependent for years. That's another conundrum when you have a situation of doing adaptive reuse of older buildings that were never, say, meant for like modern uses. So Asheville put a lot of money into the River Arts District. But when you build in the floodplain, when you inhabit the floodplain, you are inheriting risk. So to your point,
How did our communities of color fare?
well, Swannanoa was probably the most affected, Beatree specifically. Emma did better. Those are two that come to mind. Barnardsville was rough. Garin Creek was rough. Black Mountain, because they're central
Communities of color
Sure.
in Black Mountain? I don't know.
So most of our legacy neighborhoods.
Okay.
Are predominantly Black legacy neighborhoods are
Yeah.
in the city.
I don't know Black Mountain, so.
And they, I think they fared pretty well, but you'd have to talk to someone in the city about that.
Okay.
There are.
What
some-
about in Asheville, in Buncombe County?
There are some Hispanic communities and Hispanic.
Like Swannanoa, for
predominantly
example.
Predominantly Hispanic
So Swannanoa for
manufactured
sure.
home parks in Swannanoa that were hit pretty hard. Like Nate said, Emma fared pretty well.
It's on higher ground, right?
Higher ground is also the east, like the west, it's the west.
The West did better than
Yeah, the west
East.
did better than the east. So there was a little damage, but not the widespread.
Lady who cleans my house is Guatemalan. Their home was destroyed. They
So-
live in Swannanoa.
Right. So Swannanoa, the thing about manufactured home parks is you rent a space, you may or may not own your unit. And yes, those were hit very hard, especially on the old US 7070 corridor.
So what can be done to relocate those communities to higher ground so they're safer? Anything?
Well, that part is a little tricky because you've got property owners that may want to hold the property. And then when you're a tenant and you've lost your manufactured home, the other part of that too is if it's not put on a permanent foundation, it's not real property, it's titled property. That's been one of the
So
tricky.
we have zoned our poor communities, our people of color communities to flood prone areas. That's what we've done.
I wouldn't
not-
say
Not
that's-
zoned, I'm sorry.
Let me-
That's the last land that's available, I
Um,
guess. I don't know.
particularly in the indigenous community in the city of Asheville, most of the indigenous community live in public housing.
Hmm.
And I think the only public housing that was affected in Asheville is down along the River Arts District where Depot Street is, where the water came across the street, got into Greens Mini Market, the Grant Center, that. But overall, other than, what everybody else experienced, power outages, the Black community within the city was relatively unscathed as
Yeah.
far as damages, home losses, and things of that nature.
But the Hispanic community in Swannanoa,
Yeah.
Native American along the river.
Yeah, and there was some Black, a lady at my church lost her husband, her sister and her husband. And there were several people in the Black Mountain, Swannanoa, were down near Asheville Christian Academy where they're building,
Right.
where they were trying to build up mobile home parks and things that were considered far away from the Swannanoa River that were affected, and people were washed away. And it was kind of sad.
I'm asking a lot of questions, sorry.
That's okay.
I should let someone else get a chance.
I had a technical question I wanted to kind of go back to. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about base flood elevation and that we're part of that program since 1980 and we're at 2 feet and we could technically go to 4 feet in the next 3 to 4 years as we reevaluate. Is there a part of the program that allows certain areas that are lower to be at a higher level and certain properties at a higher elevation to be at a lower based on kind of the mountainous terrain that we have here, or is it all just either 2 or 4?
So I've got my base layer of requirements that's absolutely required. And then what we can do is layer cake on top of that, the additional higher standards that we can do. Part of the community rating system is you get to choose from a menu of different things. So to your point, Alan, there are different things we can do. And that's something that we will be bringing you all and presenting to you all with some recommendations in the future. Again, with sensitivity to people that are trying to rebuild and with the understanding that we have hazard mitigation grant. This is the fastest I've ever seen a hazard mitigation grant program stood up, ever.
Yeah.
And I will say this, we are the first state in the nation to run a state-centric model of the program. That's huge. So North Carolina is kind of a pioneer when it comes to floodplain management.
Second question I have, if you don't mind, sorry.
No, keep going.
I have family in Houston that lived through Harvey, and one of the distinct differences between, say, a Houston, a Charleston, and Asheville is the housing stock itself. In Houston, you do have this slab construction, but here in the mountains, we have a fair amount of basement type construction. How does this diagram you have up here work when you have a full-fledged basement? Is that part of the program? 'Cause
Yes.
I have a basement, sorry.
You typically don't see a basement in special flood hazard area. Well, when you do, it was pre-firm, and they will always flood because basements are tricky. No matter how well you build them, they're always going to be prone to moisture. But ideally, if you had one and you had an engineer, the other thing you got to watch out with basements too is hydrostatic pressure. So like on the coast, you all see the pools that are close out to the beach. Those are built in what's called a VE zone. They have to specially anchor those because septic tanks, pools, and basements love to go. Pop goes the weasel when it comes to the pressure because remember that water is sitting there welling. Remember my basement analogy in Black Mountain? It was coming up through the foundation. So that pressure is always wanting to push it up.
The Cathedral of All Souls has a basement.
Nate,
And one more question, and then I'm done.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Carl, you might squeeze in there.
we'll go ahead. I'll come after you.
Okay, I had two different questions. One was about, so I hear you saying, let's give folks some time to get started and then see how things work out before we start proposing change. concern with that is that's gonna let people get started under rules that aren't.
Sorry,
as
John, I can't
protected.
hear you.
I don't know. There we go. My concern, if we get to a point where we're allowing people to start rebuilds under old rules, is they're not going to be building under the most protective standards that we'd want to put in place. So my question is, why do you feel waiting is the right approach versus adopting the rules that we'd want to see applied in these areas now before folks get started? And then two, within the context of the floodplain ordinance, would any of these changes be considered nonconformities or create nonconformities with structures that are less than the 50% significant damage trigger that requires a complete demolition and building to new code?
Okay. Well, we really can't change the rules midstream for folks. We have to follow the ordinance, and people are allowed to do substantial, non-substantial improvements as is, because that's what's in the ordinance. And we certainly wouldn't want to prevent them from doing that. What we can do is hand them a flyer for an elevation project, which then allows them to not only start their remodel under the rules as allowed, but also maybe when the money gets here, do an elevation project. And I don't like to use the term nonconformities when it comes to the flood ordinance. Asheville recently had to fix a major glitch in their ordinance. All of our standards are contained within our flood ordinance. I use the term pre-firm. That's the terminology we should use.
So I guess why, though, I understand what you're saying is that if they're entitled to build back under the standards that applied at the time of the event, nobody's debating that. But if you codify what would be the right standards, that's as good a guide as any to what people could choose to build to as they're going through that build back process. So if they're going to be able to lock in those rules no matter what, it doesn't matter what we change, whether we change it now or we change it later, they get to pick the old rules. And if they want to do that, they can. But by adopting the new rules, we let anybody who's not locked them in to that change be bound by the new rules. And those who'd want to follow them voluntarily could certainly say to a contractor, that's the standard I want to meet.
I understand what you're saying. I think from our perspective right now, we're just inundated with trying to help folks get back in their house and follow the ordinance as is. If you want to adopt new standards or phase some things in, we can certainly do that, but I'm not prepared to bring anything forward for probably a minimum of 6 months until we get to a better point in where we can handle the volume that's coming in of folks that are trying to do repairs. Again, we already have a higher standard for a freeboard of 2 feet. Those structures fared a lot better. And I will say this, it is ultra hard to say or think that we can prevent all damages from a 1,000-year event. You're just not going to do that.
No, not asking. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying the changes that I think you were saying you would want to make, the timeline with which to adopt them so that they're applicable to those who, again, aren't in a situation where they have substantial damage and get to pick the old rules in their rebuild, but are in a different place, new development that's coming into the area. It just seems like pushing those forward at the same time makes a lot of sense, to keep those who might try to take advantage of the situation from being able to do that.
What do you mean take advantage of the situation?
So as long as we have the current rules in place, anybody who wants to start developing within that area can use the current rules versus the new
That's
rules.
correct. But
Yeah.
a lot of those structures that were built to modern standards fared significantly better than others. Some didn't flood at all.
I'm not debating that. I'm saying you've indicated you want to make changes.
I did.
And I'm saying, why not adopt them as soon as possible?
Well, let's be
Those who don't-
respectful of staff capacity and the fact that a lot of county staff are doing very different things. Some of us are working 4 to 5 different jobs now.
And that's absolutely true. And that doesn't mean that we can't go to the commissioners and say that you need additional resources in order to do both and. That's, I mean, and I have nothing but a tremendous amount of respect for the amount of time and effort and
Stress.
burden that has been placed on you all to do everything all at once, and you can't do it all at once. And that was even before the storm. How many years have we been sitting here talking about a stormwater ordinance and other things that you know, again, had to be pushed behind other priorities? That's not your fault. That's the fault, or again, that's the burden I'll put on those who make policy decisions on where to allocate dollars.
I think the other tremendous issue that's affecting the county now is the $25 million budget deficit as well. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, I'm just saying we can make a recommendation that,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
so I'm not hearing that it's not, that they're not good ideas or that you wouldn't do them if you could, but that you can't right now based on your current staffing resources.
That would be a fair assessment.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the other things that we can bring forward soon is Jillian's team is also going to initiate the first small area plan. And I'm not sure when we'll be bringing that forward, but that, again, just to illustrate, that is another project we'll be doing in-house with the planning department. And we're going to have to shift gears because of the funding aspect as well.
I think you answered my question about the non-conforming. Fair enough.
Sure.
On the terminology. This will be a little bit off on left field, but one of the things that was, and the reason I'm asking is what impact does SB 382 have on your ability to make the changes that you want to make? And that's why I asked about the nonconformities. So I'll just sort of leave that. This is sort of food for thought. That's why I used the word that I used. But the other is that there's a component of that bill that prohibits the enforcement of ordinances that regulate the cutting of trees in any area affected by the storm. And I'm wondering what impact from the county's planning perspective that is having on the steep slope and the Blue Ridge Parkway overlay ordinance and other things like that that do have provisions related to tree preservation.
That part I don't know. The steep slope overlay itself just has a bare minimum requirement in terms of tree screening, but it also has limits on impervious and disturbance. So I think that's another way of not specifically calling it tree cutting itself. But there's a lot of things about that bill that we don't know. I will say I don't think it's applicable to flood map zone or flood zones and contained within the flood ordinance, because a lot of that comes through the federal NFIP program. And we do know that we can join the community rating system with higher standards, but because of that relationship. But I don't know, that bill is a problem.
No, and the reason I'm asking is again, you know, there's that whole area coming out of Riceville area where that tornado came up over Ox Gap, goes down the other side, and you've got a lot of properties that are along that Town Mountain Road corridor, which technically is, you get real close, fall into the county, not into the city, and would also either fit into those steep slope or parkway overlay districts. And I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing people trying to push the limits of what they can do now that that statute says what it says. So I was just wondering if you'd seen that happen already.
I've seen a flurry of bills to try to undo that bill, but I'm not entirely sure. What tornado are you referring to?
This is, I guess, I'll pull up but essentially that where, yeah.
Was that, I'm not aware of any tornadoes that took place in terms of Helene. There are plenty of blowdowns.
Well, I've heard it described in different ways by different people who were there. Blowdown, tornado, I've heard both. But this is that entire area in Garrett's Creek where it's coming back. Or I don't want to say Garrett's Creek, but this is that area right where Town Mountain dumps off to the parkway.
Mm-hmm.
There's the road that then goes back down into the county, and that entire area you're seeing people, you're already seeing the clear out of entire lots that would have otherwise not been able to do that under the steep slope or its proximity to the
Well, and I
parkway.
think a lot of those blowdown properties, they're trying to get the timber out of there so that we're not creating a fire hazard come dry season as well. And I think that people are trying to make the best of, well, let's not let this just go to waste. Let's at least get it to a sawmill. So
I'm talking about lots where it's completely cut down, not just cleaning out what got included in the blowdown. They're saying this is my opportunity to get the $1 million view right
So
now.
code enforcement is an issue after an event like this. Everything from I've never in my career thought we'd see the state of North Carolina allow people to live in sheds or non-habitable structures. We're in strange times, and certainly there is going to be years and years and years of cleaning things up.
It appears that the National Flood Insurance Program is what is driving a lot of these standards. And yet nobody can afford flood insurance. And isn't the flood insurance capped at $500,000 that you can't get through that program any more than that?
Carl brings up some very good points. Every time that Congress reauthorizes the National Flood Insurance Program, new strings are attached. One string that I found out personally, when my mother-in-law was still alive, we had a little house on Lower Grassy Branch. It was built on fill, and they actually removed it out of the floodplain through a process called the Letter of Map Revision. I still had a flood policy on that because that did not give me comfort, especially when I saw Lower Grassy get this close to the house every single time. 1 year, Carl, I noticed my flood insurance policy doubled. It doubled after what was called the Biggert Waters reauthorization. Now, those are two Congresswoman I think it was Maxine Waters, and then there's the gentleman Biggert. And what they said was they wanted to recoup more money if you weren't a primary homeowner. So because that wasn't our primary home, our insurance doubled. Now, there have been other things that have been added along the way. And yes, flood insurance will get more and more expensive progressively as they continue to make changes through Congress as part of the different reauthorization acts. Yes, there are caps on what's covered. There's two standards. You would have the property itself, the structure, and you also have contents. Now, contents is going to be less, but to your point, Carl, there is going to be a cap on what you can do.
So if the damage exceeds 50% of the value, you have to meet the new standards. If that damage has caused something other than flooding, such as fire, and you are going to have to build to the flood standard, even though it was a fire damage that occurred, and your insurance is only going to pay for the cost of repairing what's damaged, not bringing that building up to the new code.
Insurance is very trying.
It's a racket is what it is.
Having lived in South Florida and carried both a wind and a flood policy, I can tell you after going through 8 storms down there that there was always a fight between who caused the flooding. Was it wind driven? Or was it rain? So these kind of fights happen all the time. But this is also where, from a regulatory perspective, we don't have a lot of interface directly with the insurance companies. People just come to us with whatever they've gotten from either FEMA and what they've cobbled together or what they've gotten from their private policies, and then we just tell them what they can do. But if you damage a preformed structure by fire as well, you're still going to have to be built back to standards, even though it wasn't flood caused.
Well, having had a business in Biltmore since 1930 and never flooded the main building, we were built about 4.5 feet above the ground. We had 8 feet in the building, a building that we own in Biltmore.
Sorry, I can't hear on the end.
A building we own in Biltmore Village was damaged in 2004. We built back with flood improvements, if you will, on slab, solid foam insulation, that type of stuff.
Sure.
Came through with really minimal damage compared to the other buildings down there. And so I'm willing to take that risk of going 100 years without a flood to be able to utilize the property versus, just clearing it off and making it a floodplain.
Well, that's a good point. So again, remember with commercial buildings, there's a lot of different options. So Zillico Brewing, for instance, in Woodfin, yeah, they had damage to their electrical panel. They mucked it out. They pressure washed. there's not a lot to like certain buildings like that. Like especially like Carl, is yours warehouse? Which one are you talking about?
Warehouse.
Warehouses do pretty good because they're concrete floor, metal siding.
Metal town, actually wood floor, but built up on foundation, so it's open under the building too. So we didn't have the,
Right. So flow through.
Right.
A lot of his stuff's going to be content related. So I know for a fact that most of the Tobacco Barn's contents are in Tennessee now. But again, metal siding, concrete floor. He can build with flood resistant materials that makes it wet flood proofed. So it's more resilient. I'm sure you had to bring in fans, the whole 9 yards, get it dried out. But if you do that, those buildings are just designed to be more resilient than, say, a manufactured home whose floor is 9 times out of 10 engineered. The minute you get that wet,
Yep.
you can substantially damage a manufactured home like that. So there is a big difference between commercial structures for sure.
I see the rest of my time.
Thank you.
Can I mention one thing that's a little off topic? Well, it's a bigger thing. And I'm thinking because we went through the comprehensive planning process, many of us together. In 2013, Lyons, Colorado had a disastrous flood. Lyons is a pretty affluent suburb of Boulder, I think.
Oh yes, that.
Well, if you like to geek out on stuff like this, like I do, go look up the Lyons, Colorado Recovery Action Plan. It's inspiring, it's daunting, but the community came together in an amazing way, in a very organized way, in a way that enabled them to prioritize what was important across similar categories to what we have in the comprehensive plan. And I'm just saying, I recommend it as reading.
We
instructive.
actually used it as a benchmark for our recovery plan that's coming
You
out of the
did?
Emergency Operations
okay.
Center. They studied a number of different communities, again, trying to benchmark communities with similar attributes. Obviously, with Boulder, you've got the interface, well, foothills, but close enough. But anyway, to your point, now that we've moved from, I spent a month in the Emergency Operations Center, really for the purpose of getting basic infrastructure and working in that realm before then jumping into the new reality. But we still have an active Emergency Operations Center on the second floor of 200 College Street. And it will be active until we make significant more progress on all the debris removal, the hazard mitigation grant program. So these are just buckets that all of us oscillate between these days.
Quick question about the Army Corps of Engineers. You said they are a contractor for Buncombe County doing debris removal. Is that the only thing they're doing? Or are there other contracts that they're working? Could you give us an overview of what the Army Corps is doing?
Sure. So for instance, when I was in the Emergency Operations Center in the worst of the worst, we talked about potentially setting up reverse osmosis systems to get water to the schools at one point. The Army Corps is going to be involved in stream bank restoration, obviously the debris, but also the stream debris removal, the vehicle removal, landslide mitigation. How many of y'all have driven across one of these temporary bridges that's a flatbed railroad car? You may not even known it, but they do things like that. They're very good about those kind of things because they work in war zones and have to deploy that kind of infrastructure very quickly. I anticipate they did a heck of a job up at North Fork Reservoir, and I think that's why we saw the turbidity levels drop. The EPA came out. They set up the turbidity curtains. They built, and I don't know if y'all knew this. This is a key lesson here. No more direct filtration. Yes, we had a pristine lake until Helene happened, and then we had chocolate milk. So what that means is we weren't set up to ever filter anything with high turbidity. Now, if you're from a city like Nashville or a large community, most of the cities in North Carolina, they filter a lot more turbid water. So there are communities that pull out of the Ohio, the Mississippi. These are examples of more turbid water. We have a pristine source, and I think Asheville's working towards having a backup system that can filter a higher turbidity rate. I think before Helene, the turbidity was 1. Afterwards, it was something as high as like 40, 50. And Beatrice still has massive turbidity issues up there.
Meaning we used to have a pristine source.
Yes.
Just another sort of hypothetical. This has been bugging me a little bit. So in 2010, was that when the auxiliary spillways were constructed?
No,
Or is that-
they did a huge project with the spillway. It was after 2010.
Mhm.
In fact,
Alright.
it recently concluded, but it took a few. It went on for a few
Okay,
years.
so we have to salute the vision that did that because that protected a lot. What's floating around in my head is what impending disaster are we not seeing and acting on right now? The first thing that comes to mind is fire with all the downed trees and what you can do about that. And I understand this is outside the purview of of the agenda. But I thought it'd be an interesting question to ask you in particular, because I know you got to be thinking about it.
Too, right?
And
Rock and
mudslides, yeah.
mudslides.
So what's coming, and what, if anything, in an ideal world, would we be thinking about as preemptive?
I'm glad you brought that up. So remember the hazard mitigation plan. We adopted that in 2021. We are getting close to the next cycle of looking at a new hazard mitigation plan. Hazard mitigation plan is going to cover everything from wildfire to pandemic. Let's just say we've seen, this is a little scary, we've seen numerous things happen in the hazard mitigation plan within the span of the last 10 years that a lot of us never thought we'd see in the order in which they came. So specifically wildfires, pandemic, and massive flood. Hats off to us, though, for passing the steep slope ordinance. 07? 09?
No. It had different configurations.
Okay.
First one's Williams.
The reason it was so important that we did that is because if you turn on the debris flow pathways layer on GIS, I want to give you a prime example. Blue Ridge Assembly, it almost followed some of those exact tracks that were previously mapped to give folks an idea of just how perilous our area can be and where things can slide. So having standards like the steep slope ordinance, I think, are a huge win. And that's something we're going to have to build upon moving forward.
Well, does that include taking into consideration, I mean, as you were describing, this was an almost perfect storm, and I've heard that described elsewhere too, that, and what we seem to be seeing is these storms stacking up on top of each other, which is what created this massive problem that we had. And the likelihood of that is going to be more frequent. It's because we're seeing it all over the country. It's not just here. And that if those stacking up events continue to happen at a more frequent pace like they seem to be, then that means what we're putting in a 500-year floodplain really isn't 500 years anymore or 100 years.
It's really a frequency and compression that scares me the most. So I went back in time to look at, so we all thought 1916 was the big one. Well, it was big, all right. Apparently there was one in the late 1700s that was worse. But guess what we didn't have a lot of in the late 1700s?
Structures.
People.
Built environment. So late 1700s, then we think 1916, then that on my desk are those pictures from 1977 and 2004, and we saw a little bit of flooding from Alberto in 2020 and 2021. 2024. We're starting to see compression. Now, they're not all Helene, but they're different events over and over, to your point. What did we just see? Just this weekend, flooding in Kentucky. System comes over, non-tropical, but it sits and trains in rain. It just trains rain, and it trains rain on the worst possible places. So yes, every single day, every single week, you turn your TV on, and it seems like we see, here's a flood here, here's a flood there, here's a wildfire here, here's this here. So yes, it's
Nate, who holds on the buyouts and the deed restrictions? Does that allow for green space use of those long term? I think I heard you say that. Yes.
Yes, it's actually required. I can actually provide you all an example of deed restrictions from '04 that clearly lay out what you can and can't do. Most are held as
Who
passive
holds
rec-
them? I guess it'd be one of the questions.
What's
So
that?
who holds them at that point?
Buncombe County
Okay, so the
holds them.
county does. And what is the county allowed to do above and beyond what folks might get offered for a FEMA buyout in that context?
You mean like say what improvements could we do on them? Or?
No, I mean more in the what additional compensation could be offered in order to incentivize a buyout over.
We'll have to get back to you on that. I'm not sure. I know that since it's a state-centric model, the state is handling all of the transaction, including the deed restriction. They get 45 days, they make them an offer, and it's a pre-Helene offer.
Of course, as you'd want it to be versus what it looks like afterwards. I would just be interested in what could be used to incentivize from different buckets of money for that selection.
Okay. Well, we can do another presentation just on hazard mitigation grant program if you like.
All the information, the more information, the better, I think.
Yep.
It's robust. There's a lot to it.
So, yeah.
Happy to do it. Happy to show you kind of the history of where we did previous buyouts. Old Candler Town Road and old US 70. And how many people remember like Spirits on the River and Asheville? Carl, I know you do. That was a classic buyout.
Well, and this may be premature question, but is there any way to know at this point how much of that space, I guess for buyouts, would be turned into green, just left as green space or passive recreation?
They're going to
areas?
go in. The first thing they're going to do is demolish the structure. They're going to remove all man-made improvements, and then they'll seed it with grass. And then what happens after that is it's typically allowed to reforest. You could potentially do. Asheville did a lot of this where they cobbled together properties. You can have greenway, you can have passive recreation. You just can't sell it. Can't sell it to John so he can build a new house. That type of scenario cannot happen.
And how much land like that do you think we're looking at?
I don't know yet because hazard mitigation grant program is usually not a fast program, but there's a lot of pressure to make this one accelerate. So we'll have to bring that back to you.
Okay.
Is there any pressure to make those buyout areas, pressure is the wrong word, any interest being shown in making those possible sites for flood compensatory?
Compensatory storage,
Storage.
absolutely.
Yeah, that would
Yes.
seem like a smart thing.
Yes, so basically you can do that a couple of different ways. The one that I mentioned earlier about Warren Wilson would have been a massive project that would have involved, like that would have been a good infrastructure build project. But if you want to do smaller ones, you can. You basically create a depression in the ground. You can do a swale.
Right.
Just anything to hold additional water.
Slow it down.
But also you have to be very careful too. The closer you get to the like floodway, that's just going to become conveyance. You want actual storage. So you do have to keep in mind just the dynamics of how the land lays and how deep it is and those sorts of things.
Question about the buyouts again. Just having grown up here and driven the areas that got flooded, it would seem like a lot of the properties that are subject to buyout aren't so much focused on housing. How much there's a tension for the planning board, I guess, between this floodplain work that we now have to do because of Hurricane Helene, and then our comprehensive plan, which has a third of our county that's undevelopable because of federal property. So we have this housing tension. It doesn't strike me we're going to lose a lot of housing for people to do these buyouts, but I was curious your thoughts on that.
Right now, we're still in the phase of trying to see what comes through. We also have to be sensitive of the economic impact because the more buyouts, you're taking property off the tax rolls. Want to also be very sensitive. And Asheville's got a very tricky situation because they were so hard hit on commercial structures. We lost a lot more residential out in the county, but we also want to be sensitive to, and a lot of people, they look at Swananoa and they're like, oh my God, that flooded, they can't go back. Well, a lot of the commercial properties in Swananoa that are flooded are not even in the floodplain. And a lot of them too, yes, there are some that are damaged beyond repair and going to have to come down and probably were inappropriately located. And a lot of them saw like structural damage. Like if you go stand in front of a building, you look at it, you're like, oh, this is fine. Well, inside the floor may have sunk 4 feet because it was compromised by severe scouring. Those are not great properties and probably would never be great to go back. But there are plenty that will come back. And so it is a delicate balance, but also very, very hard as professional planners to work after a 1,000-year event. Ironically, after 8 storms in South Florida years and years and years ago, I came up here thinking, and we all kind of thought, maybe we are a little safer. But in the world of climate change, no one is. So they say in flood, wherever it rains, it can flood.
And this is kind of a second question I had. I found a very interesting article about climatology and climate change and Hurricane Helene, and basically the town of Busick, North Carolina, which is up near Mount Mitchell, got 30.5 inches of rain, or 40 trillion gallons of rain coming out of that storm in a 24-hour period. It seemed like the Mount Mitchell mountain range was kind of the center point for where that tropical storm hit. And if you think about that, you dump all that water there, it goes down every stream, every river valley. And so every mountain community that had a river got kind of wiped out because of where that water dumped out of the sky. You were talking about Warren Wilson and that project, and you just said it fell apart. I wasn't familiar with that project. Do we have any prospects of having the Army Corps look at some of like floodgates and some of these projects while they're here? Because we're very fortunate to have a almost semi-permanent presence with them here right now. Can they look at some of these longer terms, because the mountains aren't going to move, and we get another storm that dumps right on top of Mitchell, we're going to have the same flood issue.
To your point, Alan, one very important thing about the reason that storms that train themselves over the escarpment are so scary, we were on what was called the dirty side. So the track of the storm, a lot of people think the track's going to go, like if you're down on the coast and the track of the storm goes over you, oh yeah, you're in trouble. More inland you get, you do a little better if you're in the track of the storm. You do worse when you're on the east side, the dirty side. Because of the forward speed of the storm, because we had the antecedent rain event, to Alan's point, training itself over the escarpment and going down each side of the Continental Divide means we got it on both sides. And that's why Old Fort got it as well as Asheville. But yes, Alan, don't have any specifics on what we could do, because it does involve a regional planning effort that does involve City of Asheville, a lot of the other municipalities contained within the government, but certainly would be happy to bring forward anything as it's being discussed.
Thank you.
Does the county in the buyback program, are you out targeting, looking for, or is it just
It's
completely
all
voluntary?
voluntary and it's being run through the state. So that's the state-centric model. I don't recall specifically what was done in 2004. It was different then. We had Senate Bill 7 money come, so the state stepped up a lot. But I know that we prepared the deed restrictions in-house because it was a handful. Now we're dealing with a salad bowl full. So it's a much different, larger animal. And that's why we simply, with our humble resources, we're having to bring in all outside agencies, state, federal government, Army Corps. Whoever thought we would see soldiers like going up and down our interstates? Like whoever would have thought that? Whoever thought we would have heard that many helicopters? I think I'm going to hear helicopters the rest of my life in my head.
That was my question.
I would like to say too, just as commentary, I know there's been complaints here and there, but I thought the federal response to Hurricane Helene was amazing. I have actually had the good fortune in the fire service of training with FEMA, and I just thought it was a very well organized response. I thought it was a kind of all in kind of response. And for one, being on the planning board and having been in the fire service for years, I just want to point that out. And thank the federal government for their response and thank you guys for coordinating that. It was, the helicopter stuff was amazing. We had a helicopter land almost in our front yard, and it turned out to be a helicopter from Nashville that was picking up an emergency care victim that needed surgery. And so we picked the crew up, put them in an SUV, drove them to the house. They got back, flew back out. So the helicopter work was amazing during the hurricane. Thank you.
Is there anything else?
I do. Is that all right?
Sure.
So the property tax forgiveness on properties that are gone, buildings that are gone, I understood that there was no plan to reduce or rebate if the building's not there. I believe I read this in the news.
I'd have to bring someone in from our tax department to speak to
Okay.
that.
You all know what I'm talking about?
I've actually heard that in restaurants. I was having lunch and heard two tables next
Yeah.
to me discussing the very thing. I stay quiet and just listen, but yeah, I think it's a big
It's
issue.
incredible.
Yeah, so I wouldn't mind hearing from somebody from the tax department if you can arrange that,
we
because
can-
we get
We can do that.
questioned about that.
We actually have a very close relationship with tax because tax actually helped us do a lot of the assessments because, well, they do that all the time.
Right.
But Tim, I wouldn't be surprised if there's not some state requirement that doesn't allow for flexibility. They'll have to speak to that.
Wow. And then the second question is, Beloved just bought a large tract of land in Swananoa.
Mhm.
Is it in the floodplain?
No, it's not.
Good
It
news.
is not. It's
Good news.
south of 40. We haven't talked to them yet, but we're aware of it.
Good news. Smart people.
Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. I will say that a couple of things. One thing I'm very proud of is the fact that during the worst of the worst in the Emergency Operations Center, and for those of you all that have not worked in an Emergency Operations Center, it's completely chaotic. You have to make decisions split second. The first call I made was to MSD to make sure we still had a sewer plant. MSD did remarkably well, and I will say even the dam that provides hydropower, the flood doors held, and it saved all the pumps and apparatus there. But from calls from the airport saying, hey, we need Starlinks to land planes, to MSD needing a massive generator, you've got to call the state. There's a lot of coordination. There's people that are in and out. I've never seen so many people in Army uniforms in all my life, but I'm proud of what we did as a community, especially the fact that the local contractors, TK Utilities, Tanoka, people like that, this is the reason we got water back like we did. Like they got out there, they didn't ask questions. They got in those ditches and put those big transmission lines in that were actually built more resilient and hardened after 2004, but just the impact of the storm itself, our system just couldn't take it. So I want to just do a big shout out to what we did as a community, DOT, Parkway, and just the amount of debris removal that's going to take place will take years, as will our building and recovery efforts. So I'm just proud of what we've done as a community because I think it's something that at the end of the day, when everybody leaves, what do we have left?
You should be proud,
Us.
and you should have compassionate leave.
And I think DOT has done a wonderful job. They have been all over my neighborhood, and I know what they're rebuilding and all that. So big shout out to NCDOT and how they've moved resources to our area and the focus they've put on their repair list and all that. They're doing an excellent job as well. As an emergency responder and somebody who's trained in this kind of stuff, I've just been very impressed with the response because we really did have a 1,000-year storm based on what I've been reading, and that's a challenge for any community, and they really stepped up for us, and that's an awesome thing for Buncombe County citizens.
And I'd like to add all my thanks to that too, and I think all of you deserve a big round of applause and consideration for all that you've done. Because
Standing ovation.
you were stuck with it, whether you wanted to be or not, and you rose to the call, and I don't think we can begin to know what that meant. So thank
I
you.
don't want to do another emergency operations center.
Ever again.
I'm kind of, That was we didn't do one in Fred because of the pandemic.
Mm.
But
But predictions are, it's going to happen again
I know.
and soon.
Like I said, I've worked a little bit in emergency operations, never been involved in one before, but the emotions really came out because of all the various people that were there that weren't even from here. It was like kumbaya. Everybody came to help Nashville and Buncombe County. It was very emotional. I still get upset.
Well-
Just the amount of people that showed the love and support.
I volunteered for the American Red Cross for 2 weeks,
Yeah,
driving shuttles, taking volunteers to shelters.
it showed
And
Welcome Strong. I mean, there's a reason why they label it Welcome Strong, because so many people came together. It's great. Wouldn't want to do it again. It was good to see the amount of people that came out.
Okay, well, I guess that sums it up for today.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Then we're adjourned.
Nancy,
Yes.
I need to